So my name's Madeleine Solomons, and I will be presenting Glamour in Air Transport tonight, but through BOAC, so that's a British, old British company, British Overseas Airways Corporation. So today what I'm going to talk about is how the passenger experience was born in the 1950s. We're going to talk about how it was for them flying, what the stewardesses did on flights, and how everything happened around the flight and during the flight. We're going to talk about the comfort of the cabin after the war period. We're going to talk about how the flight attendants worked and what we did when there wasn't actual in-flight entertainment, such as films projected in the aircraft. What were the passengers doing? When they were flying for 7-8 hours, did they spend their time sitting down in chairs, drinking all the time? What did they do? So that's what we're going to look at. But first, what we'll do is I will go through a brief, just a quick, now that's not working. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about BOAC, so British Overseas Airways Corporation, an introduction. Then we'll talk about traveling in style. Okay. So good. Hello. So let's get back onto it. So we'll be talking about BOAC, an introduction, then we'll be talking about traveling in style, and start with when air travel really takes off when you get into the 60s, which is really the jet age. So now that the mouse is working, this is what I was just talking about. And now we're going to talk about BOAC and introduction. So here. So British Overseas Airways Corporation, it was first founded on the 1st of April, so 1940. So originally it used to be Imperial Airways and British Airways Limited, who were incorporated into one airline. So you can see here BOAC on the screen, and I actually found an old cutting in French. I thought it was quite fitting because we're in France at the moment. So here is an article. The actual act was passed on the 12th of June 1939, when they talked about the BOAC Act, about actually getting both airlines together, Imperial Airways and British Airways Limited, into BOAC. And I can see now that it's a little bit difficult to see the writing, even though it's on a big screen here. So when it comes to, it's on the 12th of June 1930, Limited Bill provided the merger of Imperial Airways and British Airways Limited, and it was introduced in the House of Commons by Sir Kingsley Wood. Then on the 24th of November 1939, British Overseas Airways Corporation was established under the BOAC Act, and Sir John Reith was appointed as its chairman. And then on the 1st of April 1940, BOAC officially took over the operations of Imperial Airways and British Airways Limited, and the Secretary of State required BOAC to place the whole undertaking at his disposal, because obviously we were in war. Which brings me to the next slide that I'm going to present here, which is the ATA, so that's the Auxiliary Air Transport Auxiliary. You can see here that we have, you can see a woman in the plane. So they were known as ATAT girls. And the motto for the Auxiliary Air Transport was eager for the air, and the unofficial one was anything to anywhere. Now, during World War II, BOAC operated a limited wartime service. So this is separate to ATA. They operated a limited wartime service and prepared for the return of commercial flights in the post-war era. So this is really just a brief introduction. I'm not going to really dive into this because what we're going to talk about today is the glamour, but I thought it's good to get a bit of context and to understand where BOAC is coming from. Just as a quick thing as well, one of the unusual aspects of BOAC's wartime effort was supplying crews to operate a fleet of Mosquito aircraft that were used to fly from Scotland to neutral Sweden to pick up mainly cargoes of ball bearings in the war effort. So that was just a quick thing that I wanted to talk about. Now, this is where it gets interesting. We start to really enter into the glamour. So 1946, Speedbird service. You can see here that we have ads. A lot of the ads were placed in Time magazine. And you can see that we've got BOAC, so British Overseas Airways Corporation, over the Atlantic, but also across the world. So the main routes to start with for BOAC was they would cross the Atlantic. They would also go to Africa, the African continent, and then they would also go towards Australia and New Zealand, and they had partnerships with Qantas. So it was very interesting how they spread across the world. And you can start to see the glamour bit coming in, where you see the women and the ads with like their hats, and they were getting dressed to go flying. So when we've got the Speedbird service, so the Speedbird is the little logo that's on the back of the aircraft that I talked about previously with Imperial Airways. Now, we'll just go through to the next slide. So here we've got an ad from Time in March, I think it was March 3rd, 1947. And you can see here on the screen, we've got "What's a Mileage Millionaire?" So, and you can see there's a young boy, although there's actually the picture on there. So you can see that there's a young boy on the picture in the middle that's sitting on the captain's shoulders, and he's got his plane. You can see him also sitting in the cockpit. So they're trying to show that we're doing lots of millions of miles flying, that it's something that's safe, and they want to get passengers onto the aircraft, even though it was still limited for quite wealthy people to travel in those days, especially in the post-war era. So then we will go on to the next one. So we've got another advert in Time from July 1947. And again, you can see Speedbird service over the Atlantic and across the world. So they've got these recurring ads coming in the magazines. And what's interesting is when you look at them in the 40s, there's not much color, but when you start seeing the ads, I'll talk about it later when we go into the 50s and the 60s, you've got these pops of color that are appearing and that add to sort of like the magic and the mystique of like air travel. So here we're talking about, we'll go through to the next one, which is Time August 1947. Again, a very similar ad for the Speedbird service, British Overseas Aircraft Corporation, and again talking about going across the Atlantic and over the world. Now, I'm just sorry. So in 1947, on the 12th of March, the Durban to Calcutta horseshoe route was closed, and the C-class flying boats were withdrawn for service. So when I was talking about Imperial Airways previously, I talked about the C-class flying boats, and they carried on operating a little bit for BOAC, but then they were withdrawn. And then I will just go through to the next ads. So this is interesting, where we get to the first London to New York Strato cruiser service. So that's a Boeing aircraft. You can see that this aircraft, it had bars. It looked a lot like you would imagine train carriages were. So if you can imagine, like, actually you're in a train, but you're flying in the air in a pressurized, semi-pressurized cabin. And you can see they've got a bar, and people actually just get up and walk around and sit down. They even had sleeper carriages as well. So you could actually sleep there. You could get, as some would say, you could get a 7-hour night sleeping in the aircraft and then wake up to a full breakfast and arrive on the other side of the ocean, which sounds amazing when you talk about it now. Now, there are some airlines that do it now, but this was something special. So what we have here is the first London to New York Stratocaster service. So that was on the 7th of December 1949. BOAC operated its first flight from London to New York on the service, and it was the registration was the GALSA, Cathay, and it had a scheduled flying time of 19 hours and 45 minutes. That's amazing when you think about that now. To plan 19 hours when you're flying in this, obviously there were stops on the way, but it's interesting how you had to plan for that. You had to plan your clothes, the crew had to plan. So it's really interesting to see how that all worked out. Now, we also had, when I was talking about Imperial Airways, they didn't actually have stewardesses and female flight attendants, they just had cabin boys. So here with BOAC, we've got the Speedbird stewardesses of the 1940s. Now, these were really the first ones that you can see here. This was more around 1943 to 1946 for this type of uniform. And you can see that the uniform is still quite a military style uniform, and they were navy blue. So what we're going to go through next is we'll just talk about the uniforms as well, which I always find really interesting when it comes to it. So here we've got another BOAC stewardess, and this is a uniform from 1946, and you can see that it's slightly different to the early years one, but it's still it still has quite a military style, where the shirt is buttoned up and you've got the tie and you've got the belt, and it's not as feminine as some of the versions that we'll see later, but it's still a lovely uniform that you have here. Now, when we're talking about air hostesses and flying, we obviously have to talk about London Airport. So London Airport was British Overseas Airways Corporation. It was their base. London Airport, it might be known as Heathrow for some now. Well, it is known as Heathrow now. But here we have a picture of London Airport in 1946. And you can see that the sort of marquees on the side, the brown military marquees, those were the passenger terminals. So if you imagine Heathrow now, and you look at that picture, we've gone quite a far way. You can see the telephone boxes, you can see the little post box, a little post office van at the back. You can see that they've had to put down planks on the ground so passengers didn't step in mud before they got onto their planes. So in 1946 was the year when there was the handover from the military to the civil airport. And I just find that quite amazing. For all of you that have been to Heathrow or seen it, it's quite different. Then just talking about the plane, so here we've still got one of the 1940s uniforms. This is in a BOAC Lockheed Constellation. Thought I would mention Constellation as we're here in Toulouse, and you can see there aren't that many people in the aircraft. It doesn't look full, but they've got plenty of room, although you can see one man in there kind of bending down a little bit. So we have the deck, so air travel in the 40s. So just to finish on the sort of like introduction of BOAC before we dive into the actual like 1950s decade. So in the 1940s, air travel really evolved. It went from military transport to commercial civil aviation because we went through the wartime era. The spacious cabins were resembling train carriages. They had bars, they had sleeper services, and they were perfect for trips that last for days. But travel is changing. Aircraft are becoming faster and more reliable. And so now we're going to talk about the 50s, which is a new decade of travel. It's a decade of innovation, and this is where we start to see like more glamour and more style. So we're going to go through to traveling in style, extra luxury, no fare. So we're talking about Strato cruisers, which were these really big planes with like the nice bars, the big sleeper areas, and they were doing non-stop across the Atlantic. And you can see here just in the presentation, and you're enjoying a 7-course champagne dinner and complimentary from aperitifs to liqueurs. So they're trying to keep you busy on the plane. So here we've got BOAC. So we're starting to see a little bit of a pop of color in the ad. So this is an ad from 1954. And we've got BOAC takes good care of you, impeccable service, incomparable cuisine. So these are some of the leaflets that they would hand out during the flights. I've got some pictures of the actual inside of the leaflets that we will see later. So when it comes to recruitment of stewardesses, so just a quick note before I go into the recruitment process, you can see these two stewardesses here, and their uniforms are slightly different. You can see that the uniform on the left is the older version that we saw previously, that was more of the 40s, which has more of a military style with the shirt and the tie. And then what they did in 1952 is they slightly modified the uniform to make it a little bit more feminine. So you're opening up the top of the blouse, you're losing the belt, and you're just adding a few buttons. So it's a very discreet change, but it does look quite different. So BOAC stewardess recruitment, so they recruited young women aged between 19 and 21. They could only work for 10 years back then. So it was 10 years and then you were out, unless you were married, pregnant or overweight, and then you would leave earlier. So yeah, those were the days. It's not like that anymore. But and some stewardesses would actually hide the fact that they were married. They wouldn't say that they were married so they could carry on working. And what's interesting is when you read the BOAC Review, which is the internal magazines for staff, they would actually have all the marriage announcements in there. So they would say Captain so-and-so married this stewardess, or this stewardess married this person from there. And they would put all of those announcements in the review. They would say when people had children, they would talk about all of that. So it was quite interesting. So some of them would keep it very quiet if they got married. So you had to have a certain physique as well for the recruitment. They generally wanted them to be around the same size, not too tall, not too small. When the stewardesses sort of started, they really wanted people with like a nursing background or a teaching background. But then it kind of changed, and the training still involved some sort of like nursing training, just a tiny bit, but they wanted women who could speak different languages, who would learn a lot. And when they were recruited, they would have a 6-week training course where they would be taught how to serve in the aircraft, different meals, because you didn't have the big trolleys that you have today that you would push down the aisle. So everything would be served at the table, everything would be brought to you individually. Sometimes you would have 2 stewardesses that would come up to you to serve a meal, and one would hold the plate and the other would actually serve you. And they used to use old bottle caps when they were like actually getting things and serving it for the training, to make sure you wouldn't drop anything on the floor. So then we go through, so that's how the recruitment was. There were also male stewards on the flights as well. So we had male stewards and stewardesses. So then we get to the BOAC Strato cruisers. So a lot of people really enjoyed flying on those type of aircraft because they were bigger, there was lots of space inside, and you could stop off at the bar if you wanted to, or sleep in the cabin. So we'll just go through to the next one. So in 1951, there's the luxury Monarch service from New York to London. So on the 1st of March 1951, BOAC introduced their luxury Monarch service to New York using the Strato cruiser, and they offered, as I was saying earlier, so sleeper accommodation. Then we go back, so I was talking about the uniforms previously. So the uniforms, we've got the more feminine uniform designed in 1952. We're moving away from the military uniform style, and the stewardesses were really seen as hostesses on board. So they were sort of welcoming you into your home. So they were looking after you, they were getting everything you needed. So this is where we come to the first class cabin service. So I think this is really interesting. It's also written in English and in French. So these were booklets that they would hand out into the cabin, and they would tell you what was going to happen with your first class service. They they would tell you how it would happen with the lunch. So you would have lunch and dinner served. You would have cocktails. You would have breakfast served. They could sort out dinner for small children. They could prepare bottles for babies. Everything was there for you. And what was interesting is that if you see the glass in the center there, you can see with our compliments to your choice upon request at any time. You could have sherry, martini, gin, brandy, ale, beer, and then you've got tomato juice, fruit juices and colas. So you could just go up and ask for anything at any time while you were in the aircraft. They also had cigarettes that they would offer you on board, which you don't do at all anymore, but that was just part of the normal thing. And they were saying some flights would last for 8 hours, and because everyone was smoking in the flight, legend says you couldn't even see the cabin at the end of an 8-hour flight because there was so much smoke everywhere. You can imagine flights in like the 50s and the 60s with like people drinking and not seeing anything. So then we just go to the next part of the magazine, of the leaflet. So the previous one was the first part, and then here you've got all the different amenities. So they can provide you with rugs, pillows, with footrests, with electric razors, newspapers, magazines. I won't go reading everything, but they've got a sewing kit, toothpaste. There's written, you can see there's barley sugar. So barley sugar, those are the little sweets they used to give you when you took off or landed to help with the depressurization and to help with your ears. So they would hand you out those sweets. And yes, you can see it's in French as well. And then you'd also have souvenirs. So here they're saying that on board this flight, the souvenirs are powder compacts, cigarette cases, and scarves for the souvenirs that you could take. And they say, please no gratuities. So they didn't want any cash given to them. All of it was like included in your flight. So then we go through to the next one. So in-flight entertainment. So this is where it gets interesting. So in-flight entertainment, you would have the bar. That was mainly it. You didn't really, Imperial Airways, they did show a film in 1925 in one of their planes. But then during BOAC in like the 40s and the 50s, you didn't actually have films projected in the aircraft. The reason, one of the main reasons behind that was it was very difficult to install a projector in the aircraft. That was something that was quite difficult to do. So you could read. They made a big thing about the meal. So when the meal was served, you would have sometimes 2-3 stewardesses around you serving you and serving everyone. So that was quite a big affair. But for those that were in first class, for example, in the 50s and BOAC, the meal was always preceded by drinks in the lounge. So you would get up and you would go to the lounge to have some drinks, and then you would come back and you would have your drink served, and then you could go back to the lounge after. So it changes from the sort of flights that we're on now. So in the 50s and the 60s, flight crew, so that could be the captain, the co-pilot, the navigator, they were actually encouraged to go and mingle with the passengers. So it wouldn't be uncommon when you're in the lounge having a cocktail for the captain to come up and have a chat to you and actually talk to you during the flight. Then also something that's interesting is playing cards. When I was doing my research, playing cards were very popular with the airlines, and the airlines would issue them with their different logos and pictures of planes or the destinations they flew to. So here you can see in-flight entertainment, you've got the playing cards, you've got BOAC on them, but all the airlines did that. Some airlines would even help people learn another language and translate certain sentences and phrases on the playing cards. Now, what you can see here with the playing cards is that you've got a child building a house of cards. Now this, you see lots of pictures like this in planes. Now this is a BOAC one, but you see them from all the airlines in those times. It's actually a big PR stunt. Now what they're doing is they're trying to show that these aircrafts are safe, they're not too bumpy, and so you can actually keep a house of cards staying in the plane because it's flying so smoothly. So it's a way of saying, don't worry, the plane's not bumping up and down, you can get on here. So often you would see that with playing cards. There are similar pictures with matches and matchsticks. So they would have bottles and they would get children to put matchsticks on one another and then take a picture and say, look, our plane's flying so smoothly, this holds up. So it's just illustrating how jet travel can be quite smooth. So playing cards was quite popular. You would also have businessmen would take their secretaries with them and get them to type all their letters during the flight. So they would get work done, which is quite similar to what happens these days, is you go on a flight and you carry on working on your laptop. So some people didn't just sit down and enjoy the flight, they carried on working. What's interesting as well is some of the aircraft didn't fly as high as the previous ones. So you could also just look out of the plane and see everything that was happening. So that was also another way of entertaining. Then another way of entertaining the children here is we've got the BOAC Junior Jet Club that was created in 1957. So the BOAC Junior Jet Club started with BOAC on the 26th of March 1957, and it continued into the British Airways era when BOAC and BA were merged in 1974 to form British Airways. Now, the children were encouraged to sign up to this. They were given a Junior Jet Club logbook, and it had a whole pack with it. So you can see here the second part. So you've got Junior Jet Club, dear member, welcome to the Junior Jet Club. It was formed on 26th of March 1957. It has more than 500,000 members. So I think this one was from the 60s. And then they say inside this envelope, you'll find your badge, your logbook, your enrollment card. And basically what happened is the stewardesses would fill in the logbook, and they would say, this young man, John Smith, has flown from New York to London. It's so many miles. He did it in so much time, where it's so many feet. And they would actually, the children would keep all of these, and they would have a log of everywhere they traveled, which I think is quite interesting. And that was a way of keeping the children busy as well. So then in 1959, so here we have talking about flying around. So in 1959, on the 31st of March, on the 1st of April, the Comet inaugurated the Eastward Round the World service. So we also had the Comet and the Strato cruiser flying across the Atlantic. And there's also an interesting thing. So Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, in one of the books, he wrote that James Bond, when he was flying to New York, he was on a Comet, and apparently he was very disappointed. It says in the book that he was actually on the Comet. He would rather be on a Strato cruiser, because at least he can get 7 hours sleep and he can wake up to a nice breakfast, and everything was just getting too fast paced and it was too rushed. Then on the Strato cruiser, you kind of just took your time. So moving on from the 50s, now we're going into sort of like the 60s, and we've got the decade where air travel and jet travel really takes off. We've got more and more routes. We've got airplanes that can go faster, higher, that can carry more passengers. So back into in-flight entertainment. So now in these eras, we've got more seats in the cabin. It's turning less. It's quite different to the cabins that you had in the 40s that looked like train carriages. So this is more common to what we have these days. So it's still trying to find a way to entertain the passengers, to keep them busy without the actual films. But people would read magazines, the children would run around a lot more. And yes, so then we get through to this bit. So I think this is the interior of a Vickers VC-10. Now, this aircraft was designed and built by Vickers Armstrong, and it was first flown in 1962. And this airliner was designed to operate on long distance routes, but with shorter runways. And it had a very good performance for that. So this aircraft was used a lot for flights towards the African continent, because you had long distances but shorter runways. So this was one of the good aircrafts for that, and BOAC used it a lot for that. However, it was very difficult to install video projectors in the Vickers, so there were no films projected in those type of planes. So now we come on to the other uniforms. So here we've got the uniforms that are slightly changing again, that were designed. They're a very similar design to the 1952 design, but this time they're adding the gloves. And the 60s now, when these were designed, really there's a change in perception with the flight attendants and the female cabin crew. And fashion isn't just for the glamorous passengers, but it's also for the flight attendants. So it's where in the 60s and the 70s, you're starting to see quite more wackier designs for the flight attendants' uniforms. So if you see this one here, so these are the same uniforms that the flight attendants were wearing previously, but you can just see sort of like a slight change. And then again, you still got BOAC takes good care of you. So that's something that you keep seeing in all their ads. Then we'll go through to the next. So the BOAC, so I was talking about different things, that flight attendants were the sort of wackier dresses. This was the BOAC paper dress that came out in 1967. So it wasn't actually made out of paper. So you couldn't set it on fire, for example, but they were dresses that you would wear just once. And they would be sent to the flight attendants and they would cut them themselves. And they had to have them with specific measurements. So it had to be above the knee, a certain number of centimeters, and each air hostess, sorry, not air hostess, stewardess in those days, would cut it so it fit them exactly. And at the end of the flight, they would take it off and throw it away. Needless to say, this didn't really last that long, so it lasted for about 1 year. These paper dresses were only used on flights between New York and the Caribbean. So you wouldn't be wearing those dresses flying from like New York to London and arrive in London wearing that. Might be quite cold, especially in the winter. But those were the famous paper dresses. They were white. They had sort of blue on it, and then the shoes that they would wear would be lime green jeweled shoes. And they would have tan tights on as well. So those were the paper dresses. There's also saying that there's legend says, no one knows that this is a legend, that some male passengers were tempted to take a cigarette lighter to the dress to see what would happen, apparently. So those were for the paper dresses. And then glamour girls, so 1969, this is where we start to have new uniforms. We've seen the pop of color. So jets allowed, basically there was more global movement with more and more planes, more and more passengers. And when you were traveling, it was just days or hours rather than weeks or sometimes even months. So you can see the sort of like change with the uniforms of the flight attendants. So the uniforms, they became easier to wash. The coral and blue dresses, for example, were very easy to wash. Apparently you could wash them in your hotel in the sink and then let it dry overnight, and then you could wear it without it being wrinkled. So you can see the change. It's like you're flying one day, you can wash it one night and wear it again the next day to start flying again. Then sometimes flight attendants would just do one flight and then have a few days off and then go back. So that's quite interesting when you see this. So to keep in this trend, BOAC enlisted the help of a couturier called Clive Evans to help create a new space age uniform. So if you think the 60s, 1969, flying to the moon, and they wanted also a new uniform because they were going to introduce the new Boeing 747 aircraft as well. So you can see big changes with that. And then here we've got a short video that doesn't seem to, here it is. So this is a 1-minute video just showing you the London look, the glamour girls, and these new uniforms, which were really interesting because they could basically wear them in all weathers because they were flying to different places more often, they were flying further. You can see that the flight attendant in the middle has actually got boots. So they're actually wearing boots on the aircraft, which is quite a change from the other sensible shoes. And they're also wearing trousers as well, which is a big first. So they're wearing trousers with the dresses. Then we go through to, so we're talking about flight attendants' clothing, but what about the passengers? What about the civilians? What about their clothes? What should they wear? So BOAC would give out a leaflet to passengers called Airware Everywhere. And in that leaflet, they would tell you, I will get to this bit. So they would tell you how to choose your wardrobe for ladies, for gentlemen, for children, for babies. They would give you facts and figures on clothing sizes in America, in England, in France, the measurements. So basically they would give you all this information that you needed for your flight and when you got to the places. And they would tell you cosmetics for all climates, so hot, dry climates. Hot, humid climates, cold climates, so what sort of makeup you could wear and when you arrive. Packing as well. So there's the free baggage allowance, and then they would tell you what luggage to take, what liquids, what you should put in your cabin bag. The clothing as well. they would tell you what type of clothes, what and then the areas you would go to, they would talk about the language that was spoken, the currency, the monthly average temperatures, the humidity, wardrobe suggestions, and then you would also, there's also a packing list as well. So you can see that the ladies one on the right, they're telling you like what to bring with you, what type of underwear, what blouses, what gloves. Now for Imperial Airways, they would give a list like that to the passengers, but it would be for their maids to prepare the luggage for them. But here they're directly talking to people here in 1962 saying this is what you pack. So then we come to the packing where you've got liquids, they talk about medicines, they talk about cabin bags, everything is on here. It's very interesting to see the Airware everywhere. And you could even contact someone who worked at BOAC to discuss how you should pack your bags and what to do. So they had everything planned. So here, for example, you've got Athens in Greece, Auckland, you've got Baghdad, Bahrain, Bangkok, and you've got suggested wardrobes, for example, for a short visit, what to bring with you for a short visit, which I think is really interesting. And then the next one, so Airware Everywhere, you would also always have in the Airware Everywhere little booklet, pamphlet, the world air routes, and you can see all these routes now that BOAC is operating in the mid-60s. So you can understand why people would need some guidance on what to take, because it's not like today where you can just get your phone out and check what the weather is, where you're going. You would need more information on that. So that's quite interesting on that part. And then we are coming to an end because then it will be in French. So from BOAC to BA. So BOAC to BA. So on the 14th, so just going from BOAC to BA, I'll still talk about the Boeing 747. So that was in 1971. They operated their first commercial Boeing flight from London to New York. And then I'll be talking about British Airways more in detail another time. So the British Airways Group was established on the 31st of March 1974 under the formation of British Airways. So that's it for the English presentation of sort of like glamour in the skies, but it's a little bit of everything of like what made the flight and what you could sort of expect and how you could imagine flying in those days. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much.